The door slammed shut before Margaret Ellery could finish her sentence, and the sound of the bolt sliding into place echoed down the empty street like a judgment passed on her entire life. She stood there in the cold, her gloved hand still raised, as if the door might open again if she simply waited long enough. It did not open. It would never open again. She turned away from the townhouse that had once belonged to her uncle, a man who had eaten at her family's table 100 times, who had held her when she was a child and promised he would always look after her. That promise had lasted exactly as long as her reputation. Now that her name was spoken with sneers in every drawing room in London, her uncle wanted nothing to do with her. The wind cut through her thin coat as she walked. She had already tried 6 houses that morning. 6 doors, 6 refusals, 6 faces that looked at her the way one might look at something spoiled left too long in the sun. Each time, the story was the same. They had heard. Everyone had heard. And no one cared that the story they had heard was a lie built from cruelty and convenience. It had started 3 weeks ago, at the engagement party of her closest friend, Charlotte Ashby. Margaret had gone with nothing but joy in her heart, ready to celebrate the happiness of a woman she loved like a sister. She had not expected that by the end of the evening her own life would be in ruins. A man named Edmund Farrow, a guest with a silver tongue and a reputation he had carefully hidden from polite society, had cornered her in the garden. She had refused his advances, firmly and without apology. He had not taken the refusal well. Within hours, a rumor had begun to spread through the party. A rumor that painted Margaret as the one who had behaved improperly, as the one who had thrown herself at a man already engaged to another woman. It did not matter that none of it was true. It only mattered that Edmund Farrow came from a family with money and influence, and Margaret came from a family that had recently lost both. By morning, the story had grown wings. By the end of the week, it had grown claws. Her own father, ashamed and unwilling to fight for her, had asked her to leave his house before the scandal could touch her younger sisters. Margaret had packed a single trunk and walked out into a city that suddenly seemed to have turned every window and every door against her. She thought of her father's face as she had left, how he had not even looked at her directly, how he had spoken to the wall instead of to his own daughter. She pushed the memory down before it could bring tears to her eyes. Tears would not help her now. Tears would only freeze on her face in this bitter wind. She had one more name on her short list, an old family friend who lived near Grosvenor Square. She walked the distance with her trunk left behind at a cheap boarding house, carrying only a small bag with what remained of her money. It was not much. Enough for perhaps 2 more nights of lodging, if she was careful. The house near Grosvenor Square looked warm from the outside, golden light spilling from tall windows, the sound of laughter drifting faintly into the street. Margaret climbed the steps and knocked, her knuckles aching from the cold. A young maid opened the door, took one look at Margaret's face and hesitated. "I am here to see Mrs. Latimer," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Please tell her, Margaret Ellery has come to call." The maid's eyes widened slightly at the name. She had heard it too then. Of course she had. Everyone had heard it. "Wait here," the maid said, and shut the door, though not with the same violence as the others. There was almost kindness in the way she closed it, as if she were sorry for what she suspected was coming. Margaret waited on the step, watching her breath turn to fog in the evening air. She could hear muffled voices inside, one rising sharply. A woman's voice she recognized as Mrs. Latimer's, though the tone was nothing like the warmth Margaret remembered from childhood visits. A moment later the door opened again, and Mrs. Latimer herself stood there, her face arranged into an expression of practiced regret. "Margaret," she said, "I am sorry. Truly I am. But I cannot receive you. Not now. My husband has business with the Farrow family, and if it became known that you had been welcomed in this house, it would ruin everything he has worked for. You understand, don't you?" "You must understand." Margaret did not answer. There was nothing left to say that would change the woman's mind. She turned and walked back down the steps, and the door closed behind her with a soft, final click that somehow hurt more than the slamming once had. She thought briefly of the boarding house where her trunk waited, a narrow room above a bakery that smelled of yeast and smoke, but she had already paid for only 2 nights, and pride kept her from returning so soon to admit that even that small refuge might not last. She thought of writing to her sisters, but she knew any letter she sent would only bring trouble to their door, and she could not bear to be the reason their lives were touched by the same disgrace that had swallowed her own. There was a strange kind of freedom in having nowhere left to turn, she realized, even as the cold bit deeper into her hands. When every door was closed, a person stopped wasting her strength knocking, and simply walked, waiting to see what the night might decide for her instead. Night was falling now, and the streets of London grew less friendly with every passing hour. Margaret pulled her coat tighter and tried to think of where else she might go, but the list in her mind had run out. There was no seventh door to knock on. There was no one else who might open one for her. She walked without any real direction, simply moving to keep the cold from settling too deeply into her bones. The fine houses of the wealthier streets gave way slowly to narrower lanes, the golden windows replaced by dim lamplight and shuttered shops. She passed a group of men outside a tavern who called out something crude, and she quickened her pace, gripping her small bag tightly against her side. It was near midnight when she found herself standing before a set of iron gates unlike any she had passed that evening. Beyond them rose a townhouse of pale stone, taller and grander than any other on the street, though it wore its grandeur like a secret rather than a boast. Every window on the ground floor was dark except for one, high up, where a single light burned steady and low. Margaret had no idea whose house this was. She only knew that her legs had carried her as far as they could, and that the cold had become a heaviness in her chest that frightened her more than any scandal. She reached out and gripped the iron bars of the gate to steady herself, and the world tilted sharply beneath her feet. The last thing she remembered was the sound of footsteps on gravel, quick and urgent, and a voice calling out for someone to bring a light. Then there was nothing but darkness, soft and complete, closing in around her like a curtain falling on the worst night of her life. When she woke, she was lying on a couch far too fine for a woman in her situation, in a room lit by a low fire that crackled gently in a wide stone hearth. A blanket had been laid over her, heavy and warm, and for a moment she thought she must be dreaming, that surely no one in this city would have carried her, a disgraced and penniless stranger, into their own home and given her such comfort. She sat up slowly, her head still spinning, and became aware of someone standing near the window with his back to her. He was tall, dressed simply despite the evident wealth of the room around him, and he did not turn immediately when he heard her move. When he finally did turn, Margaret found herself looking into a pair of gray eyes that studied her with an intensity she had never encountered before, not from any man in any drawing room she had ever entered. He did not speak. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable, and after a long moment he crossed the room and set a cup of hot tea on the small table beside the couch. Still he said nothing. Margaret opened her mouth to thank him, to ask where she was, to ask who he might be, but something in his stillness made her hesitate. A housekeeper appeared in the doorway a moment later, an older woman with kind but wary eyes, who curtsied slightly toward the silent man before turning to Margaret. "You collapsed at the gates of Ashcombe House, miss," the housekeeper said. "His Grace found you and brought you inside himself. You are fortunate. Another hour in that cold, and matters might have gone very differently." Margaret's eyes moved back to the man by the window, understanding dawning slowly. This was no ordinary gentleman who had shown her kindness. This was a duke, one whose house she had heard mentioned only in hushed and curious tones, a man rumored throughout London to never speak a single word to anyone, not even at his own social gatherings, of which there were said to be none at all. "Thank you," Margaret said softly, unsure if the words would even reach him, or if he cared to hear them. "I did not mean to trouble you." The Duke did not answer. He only inclined his head slightly, a small and formal gesture, before turning back toward the window and the darkness beyond it. But Margaret noticed, just before he turned, the faintest shift in his expression, something that might have been curiosity, or perhaps concern, flickering behind those steady gray eyes before it vanished as quickly as it had come. Outside, the wind continued to howl against the tall windows of Ashcombe House, but for the first time in 3 long weeks, Margaret Ellery did not feel entirely alone in the world. She did not yet know what tomorrow would bring, whether this silent stranger would send her away with the morning light or allow her to stay a little longer. But tonight, for the first time since every door in London had closed against her, one had opened, quietly and without a single word. The housekeeper returned a short while later, with a plate of bread and warm broth, setting it gently on the table beside Margaret, and urging her to eat before sleep took her again. Margaret obeyed, too tired and too grateful to argue, and as the warmth of the food spread through her, she found her eyes growing heavy despite the questions still crowding her mind. She wanted to ask why a man so guarded, so wrapped in silence and rumor, had chosen to lift a stranger from the cold rather than step past her as so many others surely would have done. She wanted to ask what kind of man lived behind those quiet gray eyes, but the questions would have to wait for morning, and as she drifted toward sleep on the fine couch in a house she did not know, belonging to a man who had not spoken a single word to her, Margaret allowed herself, just for tonight, to feel something she had not felt in 3 long weeks. She felt safe. Margaret woke to the sound of hushed voices arguing somewhere beyond the door, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the memory returned in a rush, the cold gates, the darkness, the tall silent man with gray eyes, and she sat up quickly, smoothing her hair with hands that still trembled slightly from the night before. The voices belonged to the housekeeper, whose name she would soon learn was Mrs. Pruitt, and a younger man who sounded deeply troubled by whatever conversation they were having. Margaret could not make out every word, but she caught enough to understand that they were speaking about her, about the impropriety of a strange woman sleeping under the Duke's roof, about what the neighbors might say, and what the household staff already were saying among themselves. She rose from the couch and smoothed her dress, feeling suddenly like an intruder in a house where she had no right to remain. Whatever kindness had been shown to her in the darkness of the previous night now felt fragile in the harsh light of morning. She had nowhere else to go, and yet she could not bring herself to be the cause of trouble for the man who had saved her life. Mrs. Pruitt entered a moment later, her expression softer than Margaret had expected given the tension Margaret had overheard. "You're awake," Mrs. Pruitt said. "Good. His Grace has instructed that you be given breakfast and a room to rest in for as long as you require it. I know this must seem strange to you, and I confess it seems strange to us as well. His Grace does not often trouble himself with the affairs of others." "I don't wish to be a burden," Margaret said quickly. "If I could simply thank him and be on my way, I would not want to cause any difficulty in his household." "That is not for me to decide, miss, and I suspect it is not entirely for you to decide either," Mrs. Pruitt said, not unkindly. "His Grace has already given his instructions. Come, let us get you settled before you argue yourself back out into that cold." Margaret followed the housekeeper through a series of grand but strangely quiet hallways. The house was beautiful in a way that felt untouched, as though it had been built for a family far larger and far louder than whatever quiet existence its current owner led within its walls. Portraits lined the corridors, but Margaret noticed one, larger than the others, that had been turned to face the wall, its gilded frame catching a stray beam of morning light, while its subject remained hidden from view. She wondered who it depicted, and why it had been so deliberately concealed, but she did not ask. It did not seem her place to ask questions in a house where she was, by any measure, an unwelcome surprise. She was given a small but comfortable room on the second floor, along with a simple dress borrowed from one of the maids near her own size, since her own clothing had grown worn and thin from weeks of walking London streets in search of shelter. When she finally sat down to breakfast in a small parlor overlooking the garden, she found herself alone at the table, though a place had clearly been set for someone else as well, untouched. The chair pushed neatly against the table, as if its occupant had decided at the last moment not to join her. She did not see the Duke again until later that afternoon, when she encountered him quite by accident in the library, a vast room filled with more books than she had ever seen gathered in one place. She had wandered there out of curiosity, drawn by the open door and the smell of old paper and leather, and had not expected to find him seated at a desk near the window, a pen in his hand, a ledger open before him. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment neither of them moved. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassed at having intruded on his private space without invitation. "Forgive me," she said quickly. "I did not know anyone was here. I'll leave you in peace." He shook his head, a small but definite gesture, and gestured toward one of the empty chairs near the fireplace, an invitation for her to stay rather than leave. Margaret hesitated, then sat, unsure of what was expected of her in the silence that followed. She had heard the rumors about the Duke of Ashcombe long before that morning. Everyone in London had heard them. Some said he had lost the power of speech after a great tragedy years ago, a fire, or perhaps a death in the family, though no one seemed to agree on the details. Others whispered that he simply refused to speak, that his silence was a kind of protest against a society he despised, a punishment he inflicted on anyone foolish enough to seek his company. Whatever the truth, the man before her now did not seem cruel, nor did he seem broken. He simply watched the world with a quiet, careful attention that Margaret found strangely comforting after weeks of loud accusations and louder lies. "I wanted to thank you properly," Margaret said into the silence, "for what you did last night. I don't know what would have become of me if you had not found me at your gates." The Duke set down his pen and looked at her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he reached for a small slate and piece of chalk that sat near the edge of his desk, tools she had not noticed before, clearly kept close at hand for exactly this purpose. He wrote something quickly and turned the slate toward her. "You are welcome. You are safe here." Margaret read the words twice, feeling an unexpected tightness in her throat. It was such a small thing, 4 simple words on a slate, and yet it was more kindness than she had received from anyone in 3 long weeks. "May I ask," she said carefully, "why you do not speak? I don't mean to pry, I only wondered." For a moment she thought she had overstepped, that she had asked the one question no one in this house dared to ask aloud. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes grew distant, as if he had traveled backward in his mind to a place Margaret could not follow. He wiped the slate clean with the sleeve of his coat and wrote again, more slowly this time. "It is a long story. Perhaps another day." Margaret nodded, understanding that the subject was closed for now, though her curiosity had only grown sharper. She noticed, as she rose to leave him to his work, that his eyes followed her to the door, and that the guarded stillness in them had softened, just slightly, into something that looked almost like gratitude for her not pressing further. Over the following days, Margaret settled into a strange and delicate rhythm within Ashcombe House. She helped Mrs. Pruitt with small tasks around the household, unwilling to sit idle while accepting the Duke's hospitality, and slowly the staff began to warm to her, though whispers still followed her through the halls. She heard fragments of conversation not meant for her ears, servants wondering aloud why His Grace had taken such an interest in a woman with a ruined reputation, wondering if the rumors about her were true, wondering what it meant that he had given her a room in his own house rather than sending her to a charitable institution as any other gentleman might have done. Margaret tried not to let the whispers wound her. She had grown almost used to being spoken about rather than spoken to. But there was something different about the way the staff at Ashcombe House studied her, less cruel than curious, as if they too were trying to understand why their silent master had broken his long isolation for her sake. She began to notice small things about the Duke as the days passed. He rose early and walked the garden alone each morning, regardless of the weather, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance that Margaret could never quite identify. He ate his meals quickly and alone, though he had taken to leaving the door of the small parlor open on the mornings Margaret came down to breakfast, as if silently inviting her company without ever having to ask for it aloud. He communicated with his staff through a combination of written notes, simple gestures, and a kind of quiet patience that Margaret found remarkable, given how quickly society assumed that a man who could not speak must also be a man who could not think, or feel, or lead. One evening, as autumn rain fell heavily against the windows of Ashcombe House, Margaret found herself again in the library, this time invited rather than accidental, summoned by a note delivered through Mrs. Pruitt asking if she would care to read by the fire. She arrived to find the Duke already seated, a book open on his lap, though his eyes were fixed instead on the flames crackling in the hearth. She took the chair across from him without being asked, feeling for the first time since her disgrace that her presence in a room was wanted, rather than merely tolerated. They read together in comfortable silence for the better part of an hour, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the steady patter of rain against glass. When she finally looked up, she found him watching her instead of his book, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "You must think me strange," Margaret said quietly, "accepting the hospitality of a man I barely know, staying in a house where I have no right to be." He reached for his slate again. "I think you are brave, not strange." Margaret felt her eyes sting unexpectedly at the words. No one had called her brave in 3 weeks. They had called her many things, most of them cruel, some of them worse than cruel. But no one had looked at the ruin of her reputation and seen anything other than scandal. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then returned his attention to the fire, and Margaret understood that for a man like the Duke of Ashcombe, silence was not the absence of connection. It was simply another language, one she was slowly, carefully, beginning to learn. A few days later, Margaret was asked by Mrs. Pruitt to help sort a collection of old linens stored in a room at the far end of the upper hallway, a task meant to keep her occupied while the rest of the staff attended to a delivery of coal for the coming winter. The room was small and dim, lit only by a narrow window, and as Margaret worked through the stacks of folded cloth, she noticed a small writing desk pushed into the corner, its surface covered in a fine layer of dust, as though it had not been touched in years. Curiosity, which had never served her well in the past, pulled her closer. Upon the desk sat a single framed drawing, half hidden beneath an old shawl. Margaret hesitated only a moment before lifting the shawl aside. The drawing showed a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, standing beside a woman whose face bore a striking resemblance to the eyes Margaret had come to know so well over the past week. She realized, with a small jolt, that she was looking at the Duke as a child, and likely his mother beside him. She heard footsteps in the hallway, and quickly replaced the shawl, stepping back from the desk just as Mrs. Pruitt appeared in the doorway. "You found the old nursery room, then?" Mrs. Pruitt said, her voice carrying an unusual weight. This was His Grace's mother's favorite room once, before everything changed. "What happened to her?" Margaret asked gently. Mrs. Pruitt's expression grew guarded, the same careful stillness Margaret had noticed in the Duke himself whenever certain subjects arose. "That is not my story to tell, miss. If His Grace wishes you to know, he will find a way to tell you himself." He has his own manner of speaking, as you've surely noticed by now. Margaret nodded, understanding that she had wandered too close to something private, something the household guarded as carefully as the turned portrait in the hallway below. She finished her work among the linens in silence, her mind turning over the fragment of the past she had glimpsed, wondering how much sorrow lived quietly within the walls of Ashcombe House, hidden beneath its grandeur and its rules of silence. That evening she found the Duke in the garden despite the chill of the falling dusk, standing beneath a bare oak tree with his hands clasped behind his back in the posture she had come to recognize as his habit of quiet reflection. She approached slowly, unsure whether her presence would be welcome after the discovery of the afternoon. He turned as she neared, and something in his eyes told her that he already knew what she had seen. Word traveled quickly in a house as watchful as this one. "I did not mean to intrude," Margaret said. "Mrs. Pruitt found me before I could pry any further." The Duke studied her for a long moment, then withdrew his slate from beneath his coat, where she now realized he kept it always within reach, prepared for conversations that might arise at any hour. "Someday I will tell you, not today." "I understand," Margaret said, and she meant it. She had her own wounds she was not yet ready to open fully to a near stranger, however kind he had proven himself to be. There was a fragile trust growing between them, built not on words exchanged freely, as most friendships were built, but on patience, on silences held gently rather than filled carelessly, on the simple willingness to wait for the other to be ready. They stood together beneath the bare oak tree as the last light faded from the sky, saying nothing further. And yet Margaret felt, for the first time since her disgrace, that she was truly being seen by someone rather than merely judged. But even as the warmth of the library settled around her, Margaret could not fully shake the unease that lingered at the edges of her thoughts. Somewhere across London, Edmund Farrow was still spreading his lies, still protecting his own reputation at the cost of hers, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than any autumn rain, that her troubles were far from finished. The world beyond the gates of Ashcombe House had not forgotten her name, even if within these walls, for the first time in weeks, she had begun to feel almost like herself again. The letter arrived on a gray morning, slipped beneath the front door of Ashcombe House sometime before dawn, and it was Mrs. Pruitt who found it first, her face draining of color as she read the few lines scrawled across the page. By the time Margaret came down for breakfast, the housekeeper had already carried the letter to the Duke's study, and the household seemed to hold its breath, servants moving through the halls with quicker steps and lowered eyes. Margaret sensed immediately that something had shifted. She found the Duke in his study an hour later, the letter lying open on his desk, his jaw set in a way she had not seen before. He looked up when she entered, and for the first time since she had arrived at Ashcombe House, she saw something like anger flicker behind his careful gray eyes. He turned the letter toward her without a word, and Margaret read it with growing dread. It was written in an elegant hand, the kind taught only in the finest schools, and it did not bother with pleasantries. The author identified himself plainly as Edmund Farrow, and the message was simple and cold. He had heard, through channels he did not name, that Margaret Ellery was residing under the Duke's roof. He suggested, in language dressed as concern but dripping with threat, that such an arrangement would reflect poorly on a man of the Duke's standing, particularly given the scandal already attached to Miss Ellery's name. He hinted, without stating outright, that further stories could easily follow the first, stories that might prove far more damaging, both to Margaret and to anyone foolish enough to associate with her. He closed by suggesting that the Duke would be wise to send her away before matters grew complicated for them both. Margaret set the letter down, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from a fury she had been suppressing for 3 long weeks. "He will not stop," she said quietly. "He has already ruined my name once. He will not hesitate to do it again, and this time he will drag you into it as well." The Duke reached for his slate. "Let him try." 2 simple words, and yet they carried a weight that steadied something in Margaret's chest. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt, but found none. Whatever silence he carried within him, it did not extend to cowardice. "You don't understand what he is capable of," Margaret said. "He has money, connections, a family name that opens every door in this city. I have nothing left to fight him with. If he turns his attention toward you, toward this house, I could not bear to be the reason your own reputation suffers." The Duke wrote again, more slowly this time, as if choosing each word with great care. "My reputation has survived worse than gossip. Yours does not deserve to be destroyed by a man's lies." Margaret felt tears threaten at the corner of her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. She had cried enough in the past 3 weeks to fill a river, and she refused to let Edmund Farrow's cruelty draw out any more of her tears. The following days brought a change over Ashcombe House, subtle but unmistakable. The Duke, who had rarely left the grounds since Margaret's arrival, began venturing out more frequently, always returning with a grim, purposeful set to his shoulders. Mrs. Pruitt grew tight-lipped whenever Margaret asked where he had gone, offering only that his Grace was attending to matters of business that did not concern the household. Margaret, unable to simply wait and wonder, began her own quiet investigation. She wrote to Charlotte Ashby, the friend whose engagement party had begun this entire disaster, though she hesitated for a full day before sending the letter, unsure whether Charlotte would even wish to hear from her after everything that had happened. To her surprise and relief, Charlotte's reply came within 2 days, warm and full of guilt for not having spoken up sooner on Margaret's behalf. Charlotte's letter revealed something Margaret had not known. Edmund Farrow's engagement, the very party at which the scandal had begun, had quietly ended in the weeks since. His intended bride, a young woman named Eleanor Whitfield, had broken the arrangement, though the reasons given publicly were vague. Something about a difference in temperament that satisfied no one's curiosity. Charlotte suspected, though she could not prove it, that Eleanor had learned something troubling about Edmund's character, something that went beyond the garden encounter that had ruined Margaret's name. Margaret brought the letter to the Duke that evening, finding him once again in the library, his usual refuge in the quiet hours after supper. Eleanor Whitfield ended their engagement, Margaret said, setting Charlotte's letter before him. Charlotte believes there is more to the story than what became public. If we could find out what truly happened, what Eleanor discovered about him, it might help clear my name. The Duke read the letter twice, his expression thoughtful, before writing his response. I know the Whitfield family. I will call on them tomorrow. Let me come with you, Margaret said immediately. He shook his head firmly, writing again. Too dangerous. If Farrow learns you are asking questions, he may act before we are ready. Let me go alone first. Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to insist that this was her fight and hers alone to wage, but something in the steady certainty of his gray eyes convinced her to trust him, at least for now. She had spent 3 weeks fighting alone, and the weight of it had nearly broken her. Perhaps it was time to let someone else carry a portion of that burden. The following afternoon stretched long and anxious as Margaret waited for the Duke's return. She busied herself with small tasks, unable to focus on anything for more than a few minutes at a time, her mind circling endlessly around what he might learn, what dangers he might face on her behalf. When at last she heard the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive, she hurried to the front hall, arriving just as he stepped through the door, his expression unreadable but his eyes carrying a spark of something that might have been triumph. He led her back to the study without a word and began writing quickly, filling the slate faster than she had ever seen him write before, pausing only to wipe it clean and continue when the small surface ran out of room. Eleanor Whitfield confirmed what we suspected. Farrow attempted the same behavior with her sister, a girl of only 16, at a private gathering months before your own encounter with him. The family kept it quiet to protect the girl's reputation, but Eleanor could not bring herself to marry a man capable of such things once she learned the truth. She has agreed to speak with us, quietly, if it will help expose him. Margaret read the words twice, feeling a mixture of relief and fresh anger rise within her. Relief, because here at last was proof that she had not imagined Edmund Farrow's cruelty, that another family had suffered at his hands, and recognized the danger in him for what it truly was. Anger, because it meant Farrow had continued to harm others even after ruining her own reputation, protected always by his family's wealth, and the silence of those too afraid to speak against him. We need more than Eleanor's word, Margaret said. Farrow will simply deny it, just as he denied everything about our encounter in the garden. He will say the Whitfield girl misunderstood him, just as he claimed I misunderstood his intentions that night. The Duke nodded slowly, then wrote a final line on his slate, one that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. Then we find others. If he has done this before, he will have done it again. A man like Farrow does not stop at one victim. We will find every door he has closed, and we will open them, one by one, until the truth cannot be denied by anyone in London. Over the following week, a quiet network began to form around Ashcombe House, though few outside its walls would have recognized it as such. Eleanor Whitfield introduced Margaret, carefully and in confidence, to 2 other young women who had encountered Edmund Farrow's cruelty in years past, each of them silenced at the time by fear of scandal, each of them relieved beyond words to finally have someone willing to listen and believe them. Margaret found herself, for the first time since her own disgrace, not merely defending her own name, but building a case that might protect other women from the same fate. The Duke worked alongside her in his own quiet way, using connections Margaret had not known he possessed. calling in old favors from men who owed him debts of gratitude rather than money, gathering pieces of a puzzle that grew larger and more damning with each passing day. Margaret watched him during these efforts and began to understand something about him that the rumors of London had never captured. His silence was not weakness, it was a kind of strength, a discipline that allowed him to listen more carefully than any man who filled every silence with his own voice, to notice details others missed while they were busy speaking. One evening, as they reviewed the growing collection of testimonies gathered in the study, Margaret found herself studying his face in the candlelight, struck by how far her circumstances had changed in so short a time. 3 weeks ago she had been a woman with no doors left to knock on. Now she sat across from a duke who had opened not only his home to her but his considerable resources and quiet determination, fighting a battle that was, by any reasonable measure, not his own to fight. "Why are you doing all of this?" she asked softly. "You had no obligation to help me. You could have sent me away that first morning, and no one would have thought less of you for it." He set down his pen and looked at her for a long moment before reaching for the slate one final time that evening. "Because someone once did the same for me, when I had no voice left to defend myself with. I will not stand by while another person is silenced by lies." Margaret did not press him further that night, sensing that the words carried a weight tied to whatever tragedy had claimed his own voice years before. But she filed the words away carefully in her heart, understanding that whatever pain the Duke of Ashcombe carried, it had shaped him into a man determined that no one else should suffer as he once had, and that understanding drew her toward him with a warmth she had not expected to feel again after everything London had done to break her spirit. The third woman to come forward was the most difficult to reach. Her name was Louisa Bramwell, and she had married soon after her encounter with Pharaoh, choosing silence and a hurried wedding over the risk of scandal touching her new family. When Eleanor first mentioned her name, she warned Margaret that Louisa would likely refuse to speak at all, that fear had kept her silent for nearly 2 years, and was unlikely to loosen its grip now. Margaret insisted on visiting her regardless, accompanied only by Eleanor, since the Duke agreed that a woman's presence might ease Louisa's fears more than his own, however well-intentioned his involvement might be. They found her in a modest house near Bloomsbury, pale and startled by their unannounced arrival, her hands twisting anxiously in her lap as she listened to Margaret explain why they had come. "I cannot speak against him," Louisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband knows nothing of what happened. If it became known now, after all this time, he would wonder why I never told him. He might think there was more to it than there was. I could lose everything I have built since." Margaret understood the fear better than Louisa could have known, having lost nearly everything herself to whispers and assumptions. She did not push, but simply sat with her for a long while, sharing her own experience in quiet, careful words, until something in Louisa's guarded expression began to soften. "You do not have to speak publicly," Margaret said gently. "But if you were willing to give a private account, something that could be shown only where it is needed, it might be enough to add to what we already have. No one need know your name unless you choose to allow it." Louisa hesitated for a long moment, staring at her hands, before finally nodding, slow and reluctant, but real. "I will write it down," she said, "but I ask that my name be kept from it unless there is truly no other way." Margaret thanked her with genuine warmth, understanding fully the courage it had taken for Louisa to agree to even that much after 2 years of silence. She left Bloomsbury that afternoon with a heavier heart than she had expected, carrying with her not triumph but a deeper understanding of how many women across London likely carried similar silent wounds, protected by nothing but their own careful discretion, and the hope that the past would simply stay buried. She returned to Ashcombe House as evening settled over the city, and found the Duke waiting near the front hall, his expression shifting to open relief the moment he saw her step through the door. It struck her in that instant how naturally he had begun to worry for her safety, how far they had traveled together from that first silent night when he had carried a stranger in from the cold. She recounted the visit to him in the study, watching his face carefully as she described Louisa's fear, her hesitation, the courage it had finally taken for her to agree to write her account. He listened with the same careful attention he brought to everything, his gray eyes never leaving her face, and when she finished, he reached for his slate. "You did well today, better than I could have. I only listened," Margaret said. "That is all any of them truly wanted from someone, all this time. Someone willing to listen instead of judging them for what happened." The Duke nodded slowly, and something in his expression told her he understood that truth more deeply than most, given his own years of silence and the isolation it had brought him. He wrote again, more slowly this time. "I have spent years being the one who could not speak. I never considered how many others go unheard simply because no one thought to ask. The words settled over Margaret with quiet weight. She had come to Ashcombe House as a woman fleeing disgrace, seeking nothing more than shelter from a cold night, and in the weeks since she had found herself part of something far larger than her own troubles, something that mattered beyond the narrow question of her own reputation. She looked at the Duke across the study, at the careful way he held his silence like a tool rather than a wound, and felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth beside them. Outside the walls of Ashcombe House, Edmund Farrow remained unaware of the quiet storm gathering against him, confident in the protection his family's name had always provided. But within those walls, a case was being built with patience and care, testimony by testimony, and Margaret Ellery, once cast out by every door in London, found herself standing at the center of it, no longer merely a victim of scandal, but a woman determined to reclaim not only her own name, but the safety of every other woman Edmund Farrow had ever silenced with fear. Late that night, unable to sleep, Margaret walked down to the library once more, drawn by the faint glow of candlelight beneath the door. She found the Duke still awake, papers spread across his desk, his careful hand adding new notes to the growing collection of testimonies they had gathered. He looked up when she entered, and rather than retreat to her room as propriety might have demanded, she crossed the room and took the chair beside him, picking up one of the letters to read it once more for any detail they might have overlooked. They worked together in silence until the candle burned low, two people bound not by words exchanged freely but by a shared purpose that had grown, without either of them quite noticing the moment it happened, into something that felt very much like the beginning of trust becoming something warmer still. The invitation arrived without warning, delivered by a footman in Farrow livery who did not wait for a reply before hurrying back to his waiting carriage. Margaret broke the seal with trembling fingers and found, to her astonishment, that it was addressed not to her but to the Duke, requesting his presence at a private dinner hosted by Edmund Farrow's own father, Lord Farrow, a man whose influence in London society was second to almost no one. She brought it immediately to the study, where the Duke read it twice before setting it down with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something colder and more guarded than his usual quiet calm. "He knows," Margaret said. "Somehow he knows what we have been gathering against his son. This is not a dinner invitation, this is a warning." The Duke reached for his slate. "Or an attempt to control what happens next before we are ready to act. Either way, I must go." "It could be dangerous," Margaret said, fear rising sharp and sudden in her chest. She had grown accustomed, over these past weeks, to worrying for herself. But the thought of the Duke walking into Lord Farrow's house alone, into a family with every reason to want him silenced or discredited, frightened her in a way her own troubles no longer did. He wrote again, his expression softening slightly at her evident concern. "I have faced worse rooms than Lord Farrow's dining hall, trust me." Margaret wanted to argue further, but she had learned enough of the Duke's quiet resolve over these past weeks to know that once his mind was set, little would change it. She spent the following day in a state of barely contained anxiety, unable to focus on any task for more than a few minutes, her mind circling endlessly around every possible danger the evening might hold. The Duke departed as the sun began to set, dressed with the formal severity Margaret had rarely seen him wear, his expression composed into the same unreadable calm he showed the rest of the world. Margaret watched his carriage disappear down the drive and felt, for the first time since arriving at Ashcombe House, truly and completely alone within its walls. She occupied herself as best she could, sorting through the growing collection of testimonies once more, searching for any detail that might strengthen their case, though her mind kept wandering back to the dinner taking place across the city. Mrs. Pruitt brought her tea she barely touched and offered quiet reassurances that did little to ease the knot of worry sitting heavy in Margaret's chest. It was nearly midnight when the sound of carriage wheels finally reached her ears, and Margaret hurried to the front hall before she could stop herself, arriving just as the Duke stepped through the door. His expression was grim, and a small cut had opened above his left eyebrow, dried blood tracing a thin line toward his temple. "What happened?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp with alarm as she crossed the hall to examine the wound more closely. The Duke waved off her concern with a small gesture, guiding her instead toward the study, where he sank into his chair with obvious exhaustion before reaching for his slate. "Lord Farrow knows about the testimonies. His son must have learned we were asking questions and warned him. The dinner was a trap, meant to intimidate me into abandoning the matter." "The wound," Margaret pressed, refusing to let the subject drop so easily. "How did that happen?" The Duke hesitated before writing his answer, and Margaret sensed he was choosing his words carefully to spare her worry. "Edmund was present. Words were exchanged. He grew violent when I refused to be intimidated. It is nothing serious." Margaret felt fury rise hot and sudden within her. sharper than any anger she had felt on her own behalf throughout this entire ordeal. "He struck you," she said, not a question but a statement of fact, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "Because you dared to stand beside me. Because you would not be frightened into silence, the way he has frightened every other woman he has ever harmed." The Duke reached out, an unusual gesture given how carefully he typically maintained distance between them, and gently took her clenched hand in his own, uncurling her fingers with a tenderness that stole the breath from her lungs. He held her gaze steadily, and though he could not speak the reassurance aloud, Margaret felt it pass between them regardless, in the warmth of his hand and the steady calm of his eyes. "You could have been seriously hurt," Margaret said, her voice softer now, the anger giving way to something closer to fear for his safety. "All because you chose to help me." He released her hand slowly and reached for his slate one final time. "I chose this because it is right, not only because of you, but I will not pretend your safety does not matter to me a great deal." Margaret felt her heart tighten at the words, at the careful honesty behind them, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them carrying more meaning than any conversation she had shared with another person in years. The following morning brought fresh trouble. A messenger arrived at Ashcombe House bearing a letter from Lord Farrow himself, its tone icy and formal, threatening legal action against the Duke should he continue to, as the letter phrased it, harbor a woman of ruined character, and spread malicious falsehoods about a respected family's good name. The letter made clear that Lord Farrow's considerable influence extended into the courts as easily as it extended into the drawing rooms of London society, and that any attempt to publicly accuse Edmund Farrow of wrongdoing would be met with swift and devastating retaliation. Margaret read the letter with a sinking heart, the old familiar despair beginning to creep back into her chest, despite the weeks of progress they had made. "Perhaps he is right to threaten this," she said quietly, setting the letter down. "Perhaps I should leave Ashcombe House before this destroys everything you have built for yourself. I never wanted my troubles to become your ruin as well." The Duke's expression hardened at her words, and he wrote his response with more force than usual, the chalk nearly cracking against the slate. "I will not be threatened into abandoning what is right. Lord Farrow has spent years protecting his son's cruelty with money and influence. That protection ends now, whatever the cost to me." "But the cost could be everything," Margaret said. "Your reputation, your standing, perhaps even your fortune if he pursues legal action as he threatens." The Duke set down his slate and looked at her with an intensity that stole the words from her throat. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for a fresh piece of paper rather than the slate, and began to write something longer, something that clearly required more space than the small board could offer. When he finished, he handed the paper to her without hesitation. "I was silenced once before, by people who valued reputation over truth, who chose comfort over courage when someone I loved needed them to speak. I swore then that if I ever had the power to stand against such cowardice again, I would use it, whatever the cost. You gave me that chance the night I found you at my gates. I will not waste it now out of fear for what Lord Farrow might do to my name. My name has survived silence for years. It can survive this too." Margaret read the words twice, tears blurring her vision by the time she reached the end. She understood now, more clearly than ever before, that this fight had become as much about the Duke's own long-buried grief as it was about her own reputation. That in defending her, he was somehow also defending a version of himself that had once been failed by those who should have protected him. "Then we finish what we started," Margaret said, folding the letter carefully and setting it aside. "Together." The Duke nodded, and though he did not smile, something in his eyes softened with a quiet gratitude that told Margaret more than any words could have. Outside, the threat of Lord Farrow's influence hung heavy over the city. But within the walls of Ashcombe House, resolve had only hardened into something unshakable. A partnership forged not through comfortable words but through shared danger and a mutual refusal to be silenced by those who valued power more than truth. 2 days later, a second and far more troubling development reached Ashcombe House. Eleanor Whitfield arrived unannounced, her face pale beneath her bonnet, refusing tea and pacing the length of the drawing room before she could bring herself to speak. "My father received a visit this morning, from a solicitor representing Lord Farrow," Eleanor said, her voice unsteady. "He was told in no uncertain terms that if I continued to associate with you, Margaret, or if any word of what I told you ever reached beyond these walls, my father's shipping contracts with the Farrow family's business partners would be quietly ended. My father has already asked me to stay away from you. He fears for our family's finances more than he fears for the truth." Margaret felt the news land like a physical blow. She had known Lord Farrow possessed considerable influence, but she had not fully understood how far that influence could reach into the lives of anyone brave enough to stand against his son. "I am so sorry," Margaret said. "I never wanted my troubles to cost you your family's security." "It is not your fault," Eleanor said, though her eyes carried a fear that told a different story than her words. "It is his fault entirely, for building a life on threats rather than honesty. But I must be honest with you as well. I do not know how much longer I can defy my father's wishes, however much I believe in what we are trying to do." She left soon after, promising nothing beyond what testimony she had already provided, and Margaret watched her carriage depart with a growing sense that their carefully built case might crumble beneath the weight of Lord Pharaoh's wealth before it ever had a chance to be heard. She brought the news to the Duke that evening, watching his expression darken as she recounted Eleanor's visit. He listened without interruption, then reached for his slate, his hand moving with quick, decisive strokes. "Lord Pharaoh believes money can silence every voice. We must find a way to protect those who speak against his son, so that fear cannot be used as a weapon against the truth." "How?" Margaret asked. "He has more resources than either of us could hope to match. Every family we approach will face the same threats Eleanor's family now faces." The Duke rose from his desk and crossed to the window, staring out into the darkening garden for a long moment before turning back to write his answer. "Then we do not rely on families with contracts to protect. We take our case directly to someone Lord Pharaoh cannot threaten or buy. There are men in this city whose position places them beyond even his reach." "Who?" Margaret asked, though something in his expression told her he already had a specific person in mind. The Duke wrote a single name on his slate, one Margaret recognized immediately from whispered conversations at the few social gatherings she had attended before her disgrace, a magistrate known throughout London for his uncompromising fairness and his personal dislike of families who believed their wealth placed them above the law. Magistrate Holloway. He has crossed Lord Pharaoh before, over a matter of unpaid debts owed to tradesmen the Pharaoh family considered beneath their notice. He will not be easily frightened. Margaret felt a small flicker of hope rekindle in her chest, though she tempered it carefully, having learned over these difficult weeks not to trust hope too readily until it had proven itself sound. "Do you know him well enough to request an audience?" The Duke nodded, writing his final line for the evening with something that, for the first time in days, resembled quiet confidence rather than grim determination. "Well enough. Tomorrow, we bring him everything we have gathered, and we ask for his protection over every woman who has trusted us with her story." Margaret spent the remainder of the evening gathering the testimonies into careful order, arranging Louisa's written account, Eleanor's statement, and the fragments of proof they had collected over the past weeks into a single, organized case. Her hands moved with purpose now rather than fear, and she found a strange calm settling over her as the pages grew into a neat stack upon the desk. This was no longer simply her own fight for a ruined reputation. It had become something larger, something that might finally hold Edmund Pharaoh accountable for every woman he had wronged and silenced through fear alone. The Duke worked alongside her long into the night, adding his own careful notes to strengthen the weaker points in their account, and when at last they set down their pens, the study around them lit only by a single dwindling candle, Margaret allowed herself a rare moment of quiet hope. Whatever Magistrate Holloway decided in the morning, she knew now that she was no longer facing Lord Pharaoh and his son alone. She had built, from nothing but courage and careful patience, an alliance strong enough to challenge even the most powerful family in London. That evening, as they reviewed their strategy for the confrontation that now seemed inevitable, Margaret found herself watching the Duke across the study with new eyes, seeing not merely the reclusive nobleman London whispered about, but a man who had suffered his own private tragedy and chosen, against every instinct toward safety and silence, to stand openly beside a woman the world had already condemned. Whatever came next, whatever Lord Pharaoh and his son might attempt to destroy them, Margaret understood now that she would face it with an ally whose loyalty had been earned not through obligation, but through genuine conviction, and that understanding steadied her far more than any legal argument or gathered testimony ever could. Magistrate Holloway's chambers occupied a narrow building near the courts, unremarkable from the outside but lined within by shelves of leather-bound volumes that spoke of decades spent weighing evidence and dispensing judgment without fear or favor. Margaret sat beside the Duke in a small waiting room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the stack of gathered testimonies resting on her knees like a weight she both dreaded and needed to set down. When they were finally admitted, Magistrate Holloway proved to be an older man with sharp, appraising eyes that missed nothing, as he studied first the Duke, then Margaret, then the papers she carried. He gestured for them to sit and listened without interruption as the Duke, through his slate, and Margaret, through careful and measured words, laid out the full account of Edmund Pharaoh's cruelty. From the garden encounter that had destroyed Margaret's reputation, to the pattern of similar behavior that had emerged through Eleanor, Louisa, and the others who had finally found the courage to speak. Magistrate Holloway read through the written testimonies slowly, his expression giving away nothing, and Margaret felt her heart pounding harder with every passing minute of silence. Finally, he set the papers down and leaned back in his chair. "This is a serious accusation," he said, "against a family with considerable influence in this city. I will tell you plainly that pursuing this matter will not be simple, and Lord Pharaoh will fight it with every resource available to him. But I have crossed that family before, and I do not frighten as easily as some of my colleagues on the bench." He looked at Margaret directly. "Are you prepared, Miss Ellery, to stand before a formal inquiry and repeat everything you have told me today, knowing that Lord Pharaoh will spare no effort to discredit you further?" Margaret felt fear tighten in her chest, but beneath it, something steadier had taken root over these past weeks, a resolve that had grown with every testimony gathered, every small act of courage from women who had trusted her with their pain. "I am," she said, her voice steady despite the fear. "I have already lost everything a scandal can take from me. I would rather lose it fighting for the truth than live silently beneath a lie." Magistrate Holloway nodded slowly, something that might have been respect flickering briefly across his weathered face. "Then I will open a formal inquiry, and I will ensure that every woman who testifies is protected under the full authority of this court. Lord Pharaoh's influence extends far, Miss Ellery, but it does not extend into my chambers." They left the magistrate's office with the first genuine sense of hope Margaret had felt since the night she collapsed at the gates of Ashcombe House. The Duke's carriage carried them back through the streets of London in comfortable silence, and Margaret found herself watching the city pass by the window, no longer seeing only the doors that had closed against her, but beginning, for the first time, to imagine doors that might open again in the days ahead. That hope was tested sooner than either of them expected. Within 2 days, word of the inquiry had reached Lord Pharaoh, and the response was swift and vicious. Pamphlets began appearing throughout London, unsigned but clearly funded by considerable money, painting Margaret as a scheming woman who had fabricated an elaborate conspiracy against an innocent young man out of jealousy and spite. The pamphlets went further still, suggesting that the Duke of Ashcombe had been manipulated by a woman skilled in deception, that his long isolation had left him vulnerable to exactly the kind of scheme Margaret was accused of orchestrating. Margaret read one of the pamphlets with trembling hands, the old familiar despair threatening to rise again despite everything they had built. "He is turning it around," she said, "making me the villain again, and now dragging your name through the same mud." The Duke took the pamphlet from her hands and read it with a stillness that Margaret had learned to recognize as barely contained anger, rather than calm indifference. He crossed to his desk and wrote quickly, "This is desperation, not strength. A man confident in his innocence does not need to spend this much money silencing accusations before they are even heard in court. Every pamphlet he prints is proof of how afraid he truly is." "But it will work," Margaret said. "You know how London society thinks. They will believe the pamphlets before they believe the truth, simply because the pamphlets arrived first, and speak the loudest." The Duke set down his pen and looked at her with quiet determination. "Then we make certain the truth speaks louder still, when the moment comes." The days that followed brought a flurry of activity to Ashcombe House. Magistrate Holloway worked steadily to prepare the formal inquiry, gathering additional evidence and ensuring that each woman who had come forward would be protected from the kind of retaliation Eleanor's family had already faced. The Duke, meanwhile, used what remained of his own long-dormant social connections to counter the worst of Lord Pharaoh's pamphlets, quietly reminding old acquaintances of the debts of honor they owed him, calling in favors that had sat unclaimed for years during his self-imposed isolation from society. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as they worked together preparing for the inquiry now only days away, that Margaret finally learned the truth behind the Duke's silence, a truth she had wondered about since that first night at his gates. They were sitting together in the library, the fire burning low, when Margaret noticed the Duke staring for a long moment at the turned portrait she had glimpsed on her very first day in the house, the one that had hung in the hallway with its face turned permanently toward the wall. She had never asked about it directly, sensing it belonged to whatever painful history he had not yet been ready to share. "Is that your mother?" she asked softly, remembering the drawing she had found in the old nursery room. The Duke's expression grew distant, and for a long moment Margaret thought he might retreat into his usual careful silence on the matter. Instead, he reached for a fresh piece of paper and began to write, slowly and deliberately, more than he had ever written to her before. "My mother was accused, many years ago, of a crime she did not commit, a theft from a family friend, jewelry that vanished during a dinner party held in this very house. She was innocent, but the accusation came from a man of great influence, much like Pharaoh. and no one believed her protests. My father, weak and more concerned with his own standing than his wife's innocence, did nothing to defend her. I was 12 years old. I begged him to speak for her, to use his own influence to demand a proper investigation. He refused, afraid of angering a man whose friendship mattered more to him than his wife's reputation. Margaret read the words with growing horror, understanding now why the portrait had been turned, why the subject of his mother remained so carefully guarded within these walls. She left this house within the month, unable to bear the shame and the silence that had been forced upon her. I never saw her again. She died 3 years later, still carrying the weight of an accusation that was never disproven, because no one with the power to help her chose to speak. I swore, standing at her grave, that I would never again stay silent while someone I could help was being wrongly accused. And then, cruelly, a fever took my own voice not long after, leaving me literally as silent as I had once been figuratively, when it mattered most. Some days I believe it was a fitting punishment for my own failure to act sooner. Other days I believe it gave me a different way to fight, one built on action rather than empty words. Margaret felt tears sliding freely down her cheeks by the time she finished reading, understanding now with full clarity why this silent, guarded man had thrown open his doors to a stranger collapsed at his gates, why he had risked his own reputation and safety to stand against a family as powerful as the Pharaohs on behalf of a woman he barely knew. "You saw your mother in me," she said softly, "a woman wrongly accused, with no one willing to speak for her." The Duke nodded, his gray eyes glistening in the firelight with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. He reached for the slate one final time. "I could not save her. I will not fail you the same way." Margaret rose from her chair and crossed the small distance between them, and without fully deciding to do so, she reached out and took his hand in both of hers, holding it gently, offering him the same silent comfort he had offered her that first night. He did not pull away. Instead, his fingers curled around hers, and for a long moment they sat together in the firelight, bound by shared understanding of what it meant to be silenced, and by the quiet determination neither of them ever intended to let it happen again. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, "for trusting me with this." He lifted her hand gently and pressed it briefly against his lips, a gesture more intimate than any words could have carried. And Margaret felt something shift permanently within her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the quiet, steady affection that had grown between them across these difficult weeks. Whatever the coming inquiry might bring, whatever battles still lay ahead against Lord Pharaoh's wealth and influence, Margaret understood now that she was no longer facing them merely as an ally to the Duke of Ashcombe. She was facing them as a woman who had, without quite meaning to, fallen deeply and completely in love with a man the world called silent, but who had, in truth, spoken to her more honestly than anyone else in her entire life. The following morning brought a visitor neither of them expected. Mrs. Pruitt announced, with evident surprise, that a young woman named Grace Thornberry had arrived at the door, requesting to speak with Margaret directly and refusing to state her business to anyone else. Margaret received her in the small parlor, curious and slightly wary after everything Lord Pharaoh's pamphlets had stirred throughout the city. Grace proved to be barely 18, her hands twisting nervously in her lap, as she explained that she worked as a companion to Lord Pharaoh's own sister, and that she had overheard a conversation 2 nights prior that she believed Margaret needed to know. Lord Pharaoh, speaking privately with his son in a moment he believed unobserved, had discussed plans to have false testimony prepared, paid witnesses ready to swear that Margaret had approached Edmund Pharaoh first on the night of the garden party, and that similar false accounts were being arranged to discredit Eleanor and the other women who had come forward. "I could lose my position for telling you this," Grace said, her voice trembling, "but I could not stay silent knowing what they intend to do. It is wrong, what they are planning, and I would rather risk my place in that household than watch more women be destroyed by lies." Margaret felt a chill spread through her at the revelation, but beneath the fear, a fierce gratitude took hold as well. Here was another woman choosing courage over safety, another door opening where she had expected only more to close. "Would you be willing to tell Magistrate Holloway what you overheard?" Margaret asked gently. "Your account could help expose the false testimony before it ever reaches the inquiry." Grace hesitated, clearly torn between fear and conviction, before finally nodding. "I will tell him. I only ask that you not reveal my name to the Pharaoh household until it is absolutely necessary. I have a widowed mother who depends on my wages, and I cannot risk losing my position before I have secured another." Margaret promised her discretion and thanked her warmly before Grace departed, her small figure disappearing down the drive with the particular quickness of someone eager to return before her absence was noticed. Margaret brought the news immediately to the Duke, who listened with the same careful attention he gave everything, his expression darkening as she described Lord Pharaoh's plan for false witnesses. "He is more desperate than we realized," the Duke wrote. "If he is willing to risk perjury before a magistrate known for his severity toward exactly such schemes, this could work in our favor. If Holloway can catch even one of these false witnesses in a contradiction, it will unravel the credibility of everything Pharaoh has tried to build against you." They brought Grace's account to Magistrate Holloway the following day, and he received the news with the same grim satisfaction Margaret had come to expect from him whenever evidence against the Pharaoh family grew stronger. He assured them he would prepare carefully for the possibility of false testimony, cross-examining any witnesses Lord Pharaoh presented with particular scrutiny, and Margaret left his chambers that afternoon, with cautious hope beginning to outweigh her fear for the first time in days. But hope, Margaret had learned painfully over these past weeks, was a fragile thing in the face of Lord Pharaoh's determination. That evening, as she and the Duke reviewed their preparations for the coming inquiry, a note arrived that stole the warmth from the room entirely. It was unsigned, delivered by an unknown hand, and it contained only a single threatening line, warning Margaret that if she did not withdraw her accusations before the inquiry began, matters would be made considerably worse for everyone she cared about, naming specifically her younger sisters, still living quietly under her father's roof, still innocent of any part in the scandal that had consumed her life. Margaret's hands shook as she read the note, fear for her sisters overwhelming every other emotion she had carried through these difficult weeks. "He would harm them," she whispered. "My sisters have done nothing. They know nothing of any of this." The Duke took the note from her trembling hands, his jaw tightening as he read the threat. He wrote quickly, his hand moving with barely controlled fury. "This will not stand. I will send men to watch over your sisters immediately, and I will inform Magistrate Holloway of this threat tonight. A man who threatens innocent children to protect himself has shown exactly the kind of character we have been trying to prove all along." Margaret nodded, grateful beyond words for his immediate and decisive response, though the fear for her sisters did not fully leave her chest that night. She wrote to her father immediately, warning him carefully of the threat without revealing every detail of the inquiry, urging him to keep her sisters close, and watched until the matter had been resolved. Her father's reply, when it came the following morning, carried an unexpected note of warmth she had not felt from him since before her disgrace, a promise that he would protect his daughters, all of them, whatever came next. The threat, rather than weakening Margaret's resolve, hardened it into something unbreakable. She understood now, with complete clarity, that Edmund Pharaoh and his father would stop at nothing to protect themselves, that their cruelty extended far beyond the single garden encounter that had begun her ordeal, and that only the truth, laid bare before a magistrate who could not be bought or frightened, would finally bring their reign of quiet intimidation to an end. That night, the Duke posted 2 of his most trusted men outside her father's house without being asked, a quiet act of protection Margaret only learned of the following morning when her father wrote again, this time with genuine gratitude in his words rather than the distant formality he had shown her since her disgrace began. Margaret read the letter twice, feeling something in her chest loosen slightly for the first time since the threatening note had arrived. Whatever else Lord Pharaoh's cruelty might attempt in the days remaining before the inquiry, she no longer faced it as a woman standing entirely alone, and that knowledge alone gave her the strength to face the coming days with a steadiness she would not have believed possible 3 short weeks earlier. The morning of the inquiry arrived cold and bright, sunlight cutting sharp lines across the frost that clung to the streets of London, as Margaret dressed with hands that would not quite stop trembling. Mrs. Pruitt helped her into a gown of deep blue, simple but dignified, and offered quiet words of encouragement that Margaret barely heard over the pounding of her own heart. The chamber where Magistrate Holloway would hear the formal inquiry was larger than Margaret had expected, filled already with a small crowd of onlookers drawn by the whispers that had spread through London society over the preceding days. Margaret spotted Lord Pharaoh immediately, seated near the front with an expression of cold confidence, his son Edmund beside him, dressed impeccably and wearing the same easy, practiced charm that had fooled so many people at Charlotte's engagement party weeks ago. The Duke sat beside Margaret in the row reserved for witnesses, his presence a steady anchor against the fear churning in her stomach. Eleanor Whitfield sat nearby, pale but resolute, and Margaret caught sight of Louisa Bramwell near the back of the room, her husband beside her, having finally found the courage to tell him the truth rather than face this day carrying her secret alone. Magistrate Holloway called the proceedings to order with brisk efficiency, and the inquiry began with Margaret's own account of the garden encounter, delivered in a voice that grew steadier with every sentence as she forced herself to look directly at Edmund Pharaoh while she spoke, refusing to let his confident smirk shake her resolve. Edmund's response, when it came, was smooth and rehearsed, exactly as Margaret had expected. He painted himself as the innocent party, claiming Margaret had approached him in the garden, that her accusations now were nothing more than a desperate attempt to salvage a reputation ruined by her own poor judgment. He spoke with such easy confidence that Margaret saw doubt flicker across several faces in the crowd, and her heart sank at how convincingly he could lie. Then Magistrate Holloway called his first witness, a man Margaret did not recognize, presented by Lord Pharaoh's own solicitor, as having observed the garden encounter directly. The man testified confidently at first, claiming he had seen Margaret approach Edmund with clear intent, but Magistrate Holloway, true to his reputation, began questioning him with careful precision, asking for specific details about the garden's layout, the exact time of the encounter, the positions of other guests nearby. The witness's confidence began to crack under the weight of questions he had clearly not been prepared to answer with such specificity. His account of the garden's layout contradicted itself twice, and when Holloway asked pointedly how he had managed to observe the encounter clearly from the location he claimed to have been standing, given that Grace Thornberry's testimony, submitted privately to the court days before, described that exact spot as obscured by a large hedge, the witness grew visibly flustered, his story collapsing into contradictions that drew murmurs of doubt from the watching crowd. Margaret felt a flicker of hope ignite in her chest, as she watched Lord Pharaoh's expression tighten with barely concealed fury. The false witness had been exposed almost exactly as they had hoped, thanks to Grace's brave willingness to come forward. Eleanor Whitfield testified next, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, describing what had happened to her younger sister at the private gathering months before Margaret's own encounter with Edmund. Louisa Bramwell followed, her husband's steady presence beside her giving her the courage to speak openly for the first time in 2 years about what Edmund Pharaoh had done to her, and how fear had kept her silent long after the wound itself had begun to heal. Edmund's composure began to slip visibly as testimony after testimony painted a pattern no reasonable observer could dismiss as coincidence or conspiracy. His solicitor attempted to discredit each witness in turn, but Magistrate Holloway's careful questioning, combined with the sheer weight of consistent detail across multiple accounts from women who had never met one another before this inquiry, made the pattern of cruelty increasingly impossible to deny. It was during a brief recess, as the chamber buzzed with quiet conversation about the morning's revelations, that Edmund Pharaoh approached Margaret directly, his father attempting too late to hold him back. His charming mask had slipped entirely now, replaced by something colder and more desperate. "You think you have won something here," he said quietly, low enough that only Margaret and the Duke, standing protectively close beside her, could hear. "You have destroyed my reputation on the word of bitter women who could not accept a simple misunderstanding. Enjoy your victory, Miss Ellery. It will not last. My family will find a way to recover from this, and you will still be the ruined woman London remembers you as, regardless of what any magistrate decides today." Margaret felt fear tighten in her chest, old and familiar. But before she could respond, the Duke stepped forward, placing himself directly between Margaret and Edmund, with a stillness that carried more menace than any shouted threat could have managed. He did not reach for his slate. Instead, in a voice rough and unpracticed from years of disuse, cracking slightly on the first word but growing steadier with each one that followed, the Duke of Ashcombe spoke aloud for the first time in longer than anyone in that chamber could remember. "She is not ruined," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden, stunned silence that had fallen over the nearby onlookers who had turned to witness the confrontation. "She is the bravest woman I have ever known, and you, Mr. Pharaoh, are a coward who has spent your entire life hiding cruelty behind your family's money. That ends today." The chamber fell utterly silent, every head turning toward the source of a voice few had ever heard, murmurs rippling outward as word spread through the crowd that the silent Duke of Ashcombe had spoken, and had spoken in fierce defense of the disgraced woman beside him. Margaret stared at him, tears springing unbidden to her eyes, understanding in that single moment the enormity of what he had just done, breaking years of careful silence not for himself, but for her. Edmund Pharaoh, stripped suddenly of his composure by the unexpected spectacle he had caused, retreated without another word, his father following with a face gone pale with the realization that his son's cruelty had just been laid bare before every influential witness in the chamber, and that the story of this moment would spread through London faster than any pamphlet his money could ever hope to counter. Magistrate Holloway called the proceedings back to order, and the remainder of the inquiry proceeded with a momentum that Lord Pharaoh's solicitors could no longer stem. By the time the afternoon light began to slant long and golden through the tall windows of the chamber, Magistrate Holloway delivered his judgment with the same uncompromising clarity he had shown throughout the entire proceeding. He found, based on the overwhelming and consistent testimony presented, that Edmund Pharaoh had engaged in a repeated pattern of predatory behavior toward multiple women over several years, and that he had subsequently spread deliberate falsehoods to protect himself from the consequences of his own actions. Falsehoods that had caused significant and unjust harm to Margaret Ellery's reputation and standing in society. He ordered a formal and public retraction of every accusation made against Margaret, to be published as widely as the original scandal had spread, and he made clear in his ruling that any further attempt by the Farrow family to intimidate witnesses or interfere with the course of justice would be met with the full and severe weight of the court's authority. The judgment fell over the chamber like a long overdue rain after weeks of drought, and Margaret felt something inside her chest finally release, a tension she had carried since that first cold night when every door in London had closed against her. She turned to the Duke, still hardly able to believe that he had found his voice, that he had chosen this moment, this fight, to break years of silence. "You spoke," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "After everything you told me, after so many years, you spoke." He looked at her for a long moment, and though his voice remained rough and unpracticed, he answered her aloud, quietly, meant for her alone amid the dispersing crowd. "Some things," he said, "are worth finding your voice for." News of the inquiry's outcome spread through London within days, exactly as Magistrate Holloway had ordered, and the same drawing rooms that had once slammed their doors against Margaret now buzzed instead with outrage against the Farrow family and quiet admiration for the woman who had refused to be silenced. Charlotte Ashby was among the first to call at Ashcombe House, tearful with apology for her own silence during the original scandal, and Margaret, generous in her relief and her newfound happiness, forgave her friend without hesitation. Her uncle wrote as well, his letter dripping with the same practiced regret Mrs. Latimer had once shown at her own doorstep, requesting a visit now that Margaret's name had been so publicly restored. Margaret read the letter once, felt nothing but a distant, weary amusement at the timing of his sudden warmth, and set it aside without reply, understanding now, more clearly than ever, exactly which doors deserved to remain closed, and which had truly been opened to her all along. In the weeks that followed, Margaret watched with quiet wonder as the Duke, whom all of London had once known only as a silent and reclusive figure, slowly began to reclaim a life he had abandoned years before. He attended a small gathering hosted by an old family friend, his voice still rough and used sparingly, but present in a way it had not been for over a decade. He spoke with Magistrate Holloway over dinner, thanking him personally for his fairness and his courage in the face of Lord Farrow's threats. He even visited the Whitfield family, formally, to thank Eleanor for her bravery, and Margaret watched Eleanor's face light with relief and quiet joy at seeing the man who had helped save her family from Lord Farrow's retaliation. The turned portrait in the hallway of Ashcombe House was righted at last, one quiet morning, without ceremony or announcement. Margaret found the Duke standing before it when she came downstairs, his mother's painted face finally visible after so many years hidden from view, her gentle eyes looking out over the hall as though she had simply been waiting, patiently, for the day her son would be ready to see her again, without pain overwhelming the memory. "She would have liked you," the Duke said quietly, his voice still finding its full strength after years of disuse. She believed, always, that the truth mattered more than comfort, even when speaking it cost her everything. I think she would have been proud to see that belief carried forward, finally, in a way that helped rather than harmed. Margaret slipped her hand into his, and together they stood before the portrait in comfortable silence, two people who understood, perhaps better than most, the particular weight and value of words finally spoken after too long withheld. Lord Farrow's family fortunes, meanwhile, suffered exactly the decline his desperate pamphlets had been designed to prevent. Business partners who had once courted his favor now quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated publicly with a family whose cruelty had been laid bare before the entire city. Edmund Farrow, stripped of the easy charm that had once opened every door before him, found those same doors closing in turn, a slow and fitting justice that required no further action from Margaret or the Duke, only the natural consequence of a truth too thoroughly proven to be denied any longer. Louisa Bramwell wrote to Margaret several weeks after the inquiry, her letter warm with a happiness Margaret had not expected so soon. Her husband, rather than the anger and doubt she had feared, had held her closely upon learning the full truth, and told her plainly that her courage in finally speaking only deepened his love and respect for her. Grace Thornberry, too, sent word that she had secured a new and better position, her small act of bravery having reached the ears of a family eager to employ someone of such evident integrity. Margaret found herself, in the quiet months following the inquiry, slowly rebuilding not only her reputation, but her sense of herself as a woman capable of far more than she had ever believed possible during those desperate weeks of knocking on closed doors. She had walked into Ashcombe House as a woman defined entirely by scandal and rejection. She walked its halls now as a woman who had helped expose a pattern of cruelty that might otherwise have continued unchecked for years, who had given voice and protection to women who had suffered in silence long before her own troubles began. 2 months later, on a bright afternoon in the garden of Ashcombe House, beneath the same bare oak tree where the Duke had once written her careful reassurances on a small slate, he asked her to marry him, this time speaking the words aloud, his voice steady now with practice, though it still carried the faint rough edge of a man who had spent years in silence and was only now rediscovering the full range of his own voice. Margaret said yes before he had even finished the question, and as he slipped a ring onto her hand beneath the autumn light, she thought of every door that had closed against her in that terrible first week, and understood at last that she had never truly needed all of them. She had only ever needed one, quiet and unassuming, hidden behind iron gates on a cold night, waiting patiently to open for exactly the right person. Every door in London that had once closed to Margaret Ellery now stood open again, but she found, standing in the garden with the Duke's hand warm around her own, that she no longer cared for most of them at all. She had found the one door that mattered, and she intended to walk through it, at his side, for the rest of her life. Their wedding took place in early winter, in a small chapel near Ashcombe House, rather than the grand cathedral society might have expected of a duke's marriage. A choice Margaret had gently suggested, and the Duke had accepted without hesitation, both of them preferring warmth and sincerity over spectacle. Charlotte Ashby stood among the witnesses, finally forgiven and grateful for it, along with Eleanor Whitfield, Louisa Bramwell and her husband, and Grace Thornberry, each of them present not merely as guests, but as women who had helped build, testimony by testimony, the case that had ultimately freed Margaret from the shadow Edmund Farrow had cast over her life. Mrs. Pruitt wept openly during the ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and murmuring to anyone nearby that she had never expected to see His Grace so happy, not in all her years of service at Ashcombe House. When the Duke spoke his vows aloud, his voice steady and clear despite the small crowd gathered to witness it, Margaret felt the full weight of how far they had both traveled since that cold night at the iron gates. Two people who had each, in their own way, been silenced by cruelty and circumstance, finding in one another the courage to speak again. As they walked from the chapel together as husband and wife, the winter sun breaking pale and bright through scattered clouds overhead, Margaret thought once more of every door that had closed against her in that terrible first week of her disgrace. Her uncle's townhouse, Mrs. Latimer's warm and golden windows, every family who had once claimed to love her turning her away without a second glance. She felt, strangely, a quiet gratitude even for those closed doors now, understanding that each refusal had carried her one step further along the cold London streets, one step closer to the iron gates of Ashcombe House, where the only door that had ever truly mattered had been waiting, patiently and silently, to open for her at last. Spring came early to Ashcombe House the following year, and with it came a letter that Margaret had not expected, sealed with the crest of a family she barely remembered from her earlier life in society. It was from Lady Vane, an elderly widow who had once been a close friend of the Duke's mother, and who wrote now to say that she had followed the story of the inquiry with great interest and admiration, and that she wished to establish, with Margaret's help, a quiet fund to assist women who found themselves cast out by family or society through no fault of their own. Margaret read the letter twice at the breakfast table, her heart quickening with an excitement she had not felt since her wedding day. She brought it immediately to her husband, who was seated across from her reviewing correspondence of his own, his voice now fully recovered, and used often, though he still valued silence in the quiet mornings they shared together. "She wants my help," Margaret said, still slightly disbelieving. "She wants to build something that might have saved me those weeks of knocking on closed doors, if it had existed when I needed it most." The Duke set down his letter and smiled, an expression that had become far more natural to him over the months of their marriage than it had ever been during his years of solitary silence. "Then you must help her," he said simply. "Who better to guide such an effort than a woman who understands exactly what it costs to be turned away?" Margaret traveled to Lady Vane's home the following week, and the two women spent the afternoon in careful discussion, sketching out the beginnings of what would eventually become a modest but steady refuge. A house not far from Bloomsbury where women facing scandal, poverty, or family rejection could find shelter, food, and quiet support while they found their footing again. Margaret thought often, during those planning sessions, of the 6 doors that had closed against her in a single terrible morning, and resolved that the house she and Lady Vane were building would never close its own door against anyone who arrived there in genuine need. The Duke supported the endeavor fully, offering not only his own resources but his growing influence within society, an influence he now wielded with far more purpose than he ever had in his years of isolation. Where he had once avoided every social gathering, He now attended them selectively, using his presence and his restored voice to speak plainly about the dangers of unchecked cruelty hidden behind wealth and charm, a subject he understood now, through Margaret and through his own family's history, better than almost anyone else in London. By midsummer, the house near Bloomsbury had welcomed its first residents. 3 women in circumstances not unlike Margaret's own had once been, each of them arriving with little more than a small bag of belongings and the particular exhaustion of someone who had run out of doors to knock on. Margaret visited often, sitting with them in the modest parlor, listening to their stories with the same patience the Duke had once shown her, offering not pity but practical help and the simple, powerful reassurance that they were believed. One evening in late summer, as Margaret and the Duke walked together through the garden at Ashcombe House, the same garden where he had once proposed beneath the bare oak tree, she found herself reflecting on how completely her life had changed in little more than a year. She had arrived at these gates as a woman with nothing, collapsed and freezing, certain that her life as she had known it was finished entirely. She left that same night's memory behind her now not as a wound but as the beginning of everything that had followed, the trust built slowly through silence and patience, the courage gathered from other women equally determined not to be silenced, the love that had grown quietly and then all at once between 2 people who had each been failed, in different ways, by those who should have protected them. "Do you ever think of that first night?" Margaret asked, slipping her arm through his as they walked beneath the darkening summer sky. The Duke considered the question for a moment before answering, his voice warm now, entirely his own. "Often," he said. "I think of how close I came to simply having my staff attend to you and retiring to bed without a second thought, as any other gentleman in London might have done that night. I think of how different both our lives would be now if I had made that choice instead." "What made you choose differently?" Margaret asked, though she had wondered this before and never quite found the courage to ask him directly. He was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret waited, patient now in a way she had learned from him over their months together, understanding that his answers often arrived more fully when given time, rather than pressed for immediately. "I saw something in your face, even unconscious there at my gates," he said finally, "that reminded me of my mother's portrait, the one I had kept turned to the wall for so many years because I could not bear to look at it. Some quiet dignity, even in complete despair. I told myself, standing there in the cold, that I would not make the same mistake twice, that I would not let another woman with that same quiet dignity be turned away from a door I had the power to open." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness now but from the particular fullness of being loved so completely, and so thoughtfully by a man who had once believed himself beyond speaking such feelings aloud. She rose onto her toes and kissed him gently beneath the summer stars, grateful beyond words for the night 3 years of scandal and silence had finally led her to. Their work together continued in the years that followed, the small house near Bloomsbury growing into a respected and quietly influential institution, known throughout London not for scandal or gossip but for the simple, steady help it offered to women who had nowhere else to turn. Margaret often thought of her own difficult journey when new arrivals came through its doors, frightened and uncertain, and she made certain, every single time, that they were greeted not with judgment, but with the same quiet welcome she had once received, unexpectedly and gratefully, at the gates of Ashcombe House on the coldest night of her life. The Duke, for his part, never fully lost the habit of quiet reflection that his years of silence had given him, though he spoke freely now whenever the moment called for it, his voice carrying an authority in London society that few had expected from the man once known only as the silent recluse of Ashcombe House. He used that voice, again and again, in defense of those who could not yet speak for themselves, honoring in every instance the memory of the mother he had failed to protect, and the promise he had made never to fail so completely again. 2 years after the wedding, Margaret gave birth to a daughter, a small and healthy girl with her father's steady gray eyes and, as she grew, a curious and observant nature that reminded Margaret often of the quiet, careful way the Duke had always watched the world before choosing his words. They named her Rose, after the Duke's mother, and Margaret made certain the child grew up hearing the full story of her grandmother, not as a source of shame but as a reminder of why truth and courage mattered more than comfort or convenience. Lord Farrow's family never fully recovered its former standing in London society, and Edmund Farrow himself eventually left the city altogether, settling somewhere in the countryside where his family name carried less weight, and fewer people remembered the details of the inquiry that had ended his prospects among London's finer families. Margaret felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet relief that his particular cruelty could no longer easily find new victims among women unaware of his history. Charlotte Ashby remained a close and steady friend through the years that followed, her own marriage proceeding happily, despite the shadow the original scandal had briefly cast over her engagement party. She often visited Ashcombe House with her own growing family, and Margaret cherished these visits, grateful that the friendship broken so painfully by rumor and fear had ultimately mended into something even stronger than before. Eleanor Whitfield married 2 years after the inquiry, choosing for herself a quiet and gentle man who valued her courage rather than fearing the scandal her testimony had briefly attached to her family's name. Louisa Bramwell's marriage grew only stronger with the honesty that had finally passed between her and her husband, and she wrote to Margaret often, her letters filled with a warmth and openness that had been entirely absent during the fearful years of her silence. Grace Thornberry rose steadily in her new position, eventually becoming a companion to a family of considerable standing, who valued her integrity above all else, exactly as she deserved. Margaret often reflected, in quiet moments in the garden at Ashcombe House, on how strange and winding the path had been that carried her from that first terrible morning of closed doors to the full and settled happiness she now called her life. She had learned, through every difficult step of that journey, that the people worth keeping close were rarely the ones who arrived first or spoke the loudest, but the ones who remained steady through silence, through danger, and through every door that had ever threatened to close. Sometimes, on quiet winter evenings much like the one that had first brought her stumbling through the cold to the gates of Ashcombe House, Margaret would stand at the tall windows of the library, watching snow settle over the same iron gates that had once seemed to her like the very edge of hope itself, and feel a deep and settled gratitude for the strange mercy of that terrible night. Had even one of the earlier doors opened for her, had her uncle or Mrs. Latimer shown even a fraction of the kindness she had once expected from them, she might never have walked far enough, or grown desperate enough, to find her way to the one door that had truly been waiting for her all along. The house near Bloomsbury continued its quiet work for many years afterward, its doors always open to women who arrived with nothing but the particular exhaustion of having been turned away too many times to count. Margaret visited it regularly even as her own family grew, teaching young Rose from an early age the value of listening carefully to those the rest of the world too often chose to ignore. And Margaret Ellery, once turned away from every door in London, found that she had built, alongside the man who had opened the very last one, a life far richer and more purposeful than anything the closed doors of her earlier existence could ever have offered her. Every scandal, every cruelty, every cold and desperate night had led her, however painfully, to exactly where she was always meant to be, standing beside a man whose silence had once seemed like his greatest weakness, but who had taught her, in the end, that the truest strength often lies not in how loudly a person speaks, but in when, and for whom, they finally choose to raise their voice.